presentation on that was presented by Sir just in front of me. In concise, I wrote racial blind European economic reductionism, which seems to me the best way to describe a truly fascinating intellectual acrobacy to portray migration or ideas that we tend to attribute to the right, but using some Marxist Marx as a reference and the combination of white men in American universities. But overall, the problem is the same, is that migration is a problem that needs to be addressed, and if we not address, if we don't problematize it in the way the others do, then we're gonna face troubles without talking about, for example, and I'm gonna link it to the last presentation and up here I have a question to Tariq, but we can talk about it later. Which is, again, the question of racial blindness is extremely concerning in the sense that there was no problem of refugee crisis. The problem of refugee crisis only led to the rise of the discourse that you mentioned on the reinforcement of the Schengen when it came from Muslim brown people. It was not the case when it came from Ukraine. In fact, Europe is interested in expanding and including other people on the other side. So the causal relation that you described in the rise of this terminology was only valid when it was about brown Muslim people. So having all these conversations about reducing it to economic factors or portraying it as this homogeneous reaction to an external threat without centering the core problem of internal identity crisis that is happening within Europe, both on the right and the left. The left in Europe is certainly in terms of nuance slightly less racist than the right. However, the racial factors, and I mean racial not only in terms of skin tone, I also see question of Islamophobia as a form of racism because it's not about the religion, it's more about the identity of people. So, and to finish, what I learned from the interventions today, that the discourse that we hear from people like Qais Said are not coming from the individual, as Tariq was mentioning early, but are pretty common, ironically, from someone who spent his time in university, his career, and end up with this rhetoric. The difference, I looked at my colleague right next to me, and I told him literally as if I'm listening to him, but probably with a colder tone and a different accent. So I think there is much more work that needs to be done in both terms. We're trying to make comparison between the reaction of Europe to the Ukrainian migration crisis, and same thing, try to look to other factors than economic, because the most recent literature on preferences and people's reactions based on more less biased methods, experimental methods, shows that concerns about fear of losing jobs is mostly a rhetorical argument that is advanced by people when questions of explicit overt racism are taboo. So in reality, this fear is much more driven by other factors, and it's more a rhetorical justification for their position than anything else. And I'll end here.
Casse un tabou finalement, un discours un tout petit peu politiquement correct avec cette question de la migration. Et pour nous universitaires, je pense, pour cette communauté universitaire, on a besoin véritablement de se démarquer de ce discours un tout petit peu humaniste, humanitaire, etc., qui n'est qu'un moteur pour le populisme. Comme quoi c'est une crise humanitaire, oui, c'est une crise humanitaire, c'est une crise d'identité, etc., mais c'est aussi une crise ou un dossier très géopolitique, et c'est aussi un dossier économique. Il ne faut pas avoir de tabou à avoir sur cette question. Oui, l'immigration clandestine profite aux plus riches, il y a une intégration classiste, je suis très d'accord. Et elle est très désavantageuse aux plus démunis. Bon, voilà. La question que j'aimerais poser véritablement à monsieur le professeur, qui a mentionné le besoin d'avoir de nouveaux paradigmes, donc de changer de paradigme. Est-ce que cette solution de taxer le travail ou les sociétés, les entreprises italiennes ou européennes qui utilisent les immigrés finalement, est-ce que c'est et donc de redistribuer un tout petit peu les revenus, est-ce que c'est une solution italo-italienne ou est-ce que c'est une solution pour vous qui est globale, hein? Il y a aussi c'est ça un tout petit peu la question, est-ce que c'est véritablement un changement de paradigme ou on est encore une fois dans ces paradigmes un tout petit peu européens qu'on doit trouver notre solution? Et puis, comme l'a parfaitement remarqué monsieur le professeur, il y a un autre aspect de l'immigration, on leur donnera de l'argent et puis débrouillez-vous, et puis nous avons notre aspect, voilà. Donc, je suis pas certain si c'est un véritable changement. La question à Tarek, maintenant, mais aussi au professeur, la tendance géopolitique. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas véritablement une sorte de solidarité italo-tunisienne, finalement? Mélanie, c'est une réaction à l'Europe aussi. C'est une grande réaction à l'Europe. Moi, je sens qu'il y a un tout petit peu cet échange entre l'Italie, indéfiniment à droite, qui réagit à la politique de Bruxelles sur les questions, on va dire, de l'immigration, et qui trouve l'écho, finalement, qui trouve le répondant de ces politiques dans ce nouveau partenaire qui est le président Kais Saïed. Et on remarque un tout petit peu la démarcation française sur cette entente italo-tunisienne, finalement. Est-ce que vous parlez de centralisation des relations italo-tunisiennes? C'est un concours de circonstances qui fait qu'il y a peut-être, je le dis avec toute la réserve du monde, une sorte d'axe, peut-être, ou une sorte d'entente tuniso-italienne qui s'identifie aussi en contrariété avec la France, avec les partenaires un tout petit peu traditionnels de la Tunisie en Europe. Il faudrait voir. Je dirais finalement, une troisième remarque très rapidement, ce qu'a dit monsieur le professeur avec beaucoup de diplomatie, je le dirais clairement, les mémorandums, c'est tout simplement la manière la plus juridique d'échapper aux conventions, aux traités finalement. On n'a pas besoin que ces accords finalement soient discutés devant le Parlement européen. On n'a pas besoin de la compétence de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme. On n'a pas besoin que ce soit véritablement un débat politique et institutionnel européen avec des régimes qui ne sont pas véritablement très fréquentable dans la vision très démocratique peut-être européenne, etc. Il y a un autre accord qui a été signé avec l'Égypte de Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. C'est le même accord, mais avec des montants qui... Et donc je pense que c'est une manière un tout petit peu, je dirais le terme lâche, d'échapper un tout petit peu à ces contrôles institutionnels, à ce débat institutionnel. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
I speak in English because my French is very bad. Well, thank you so much. First, let me say that it was a very enriching dialogue. I learned a lot, and I found, on one hand, Hatem's introduction very useful to understand how to critically review what is going on from the perspective of Tunisia and the Tunisian interest. And here my remark is just a remark. It's about how do we define what is the interest of Tunisia or a society as such? Is it the interest of the people, those who are governed, or the interest of those who govern in a certain moment? And it's really a difference that matters in Tunisia, in Italy, anywhere, and makes this field of research very contested. I mean, how do we define what is the interest of Italy with regard to migration, and how do we define what is the interest of Tunisia? Democracy is there to show the way, but we know that democracy may fail. We've spoken about populism. What I see as an important difference is that in Europe we have checks and balances, and this is one thing that is really important. Yes, of course, we are living in an historical moment where the state is back, the Hobbesian state, but still courts are there to protect rights, and human rights are understood as something that is part of the European DNA. And now we have to deal with the limits of this. We have to deal with the issue, how do we struggle a balance between the purposes, the political goals, and human rights. And this is just a very broad reflection on what is going on in Europe, but also on the perspective of migration in Tunisia. And I have a question here for Tarek. I found his presentation very fascinating. The historical and geopolitical perspective he offered was very helpful. Now, how do you see the role of Tunisia in 10, 15 years from now? It's difficult to assess, of course, but as far as I understand, we can say that there is a basic option. One is Tunisia nurturing cooperation with the rest of the Maghreb and promoting perhaps mobility and economic development. Another is to have a focus on Europe, on Italy perhaps, and ultimately end up as operating as European gatekeeper. Is that the future? Is it the role of gatekeeper of the Schengen area something that you see in the future of Tunisia, or otherwise you see more a perspective of Tunisia cooperating with Algeria, with Libya, and saying, okay, Europe, you can wait. We have our own mobility, our own mechanisms of managing migration, and we also need to manage migration in our own interest. You were telling us there is a demography issue here, so we need some sort of migration. I mean, it's a very broad question. I understand it's difficult to answer that, but I would be interested in understanding how do you see Tunisian government reacting to these different kind of inputs and interests in the long term. Thank you.
Votre intervention va à l'encontre à la position directe de votre intervention, parce que le changement de paradigme, ça nécessite un changement au niveau des institutions et des structures qui produisent les concepts et les théories. Parce que dans l'application, le droit, c'est l'un des éléments principales qui produisent en fait la manière de voir les choses et de les résoudre. Ma question, par exemple, quand vous proposez le changement de paradigme, est-ce qu'il y a des échappatoires, ou en quelque sorte des points qu'on peut utiliser dans le cadre juridique européen, par exemple, dans le cadre de la coopération au niveau des sociétés civiles, au niveau, je ne sais pas, est-ce qu'il y a des solutions pour vraiment trouver quelque sorte des solutions pour trouver de nouveaux paradigmes, vraiment. En même temps, les remarques de la dernière intervention, elle est très importante, parce que quand vous évoquez l'intérêt européen comme s'il s'agit d'un seul intérêt, quand je lis par exemple Emmanuel Todd, La défaite de l'Occident, je ne vois pas que l'intérêt européen est produit vraiment dans le cadre du peuple. Il y a aussi des classes de riches, d'idéologies, de politiques qui sont vraiment dominants et qui produisent l'intérêt européen. Et même dans notre collaboration avec la société civile alternative, les organisations, on ne trouve pas vraiment de solutions ou des espaces plus larges pour collaborer avec eux. C'est-à-dire il y a des encadrements, il y a des structures vraiment qui imposent de substances et de formes d'intérêt européen ou occidental dans la région arabo-musulmane ou en Tunisie en général. En ce qui concerne la rive sud et la Tunisie, c'est vrai, l'intérêt arabo-musulman il n'est pas unique. On peut parler d'un intérêt de toute une région, même de l'intérêt de la Tunisie. Sa production lui-même elle est problématique. Dans la prochaine période, peut-être M. Tarek va développer encore. on va trouver des problèmes pour défendre vraiment l'intérêt sociopolitique et culturel du peuple tunisien. Parce que encore les dynamiques de séparation et de séparation entre le régime et le peuple sont encore existantes.
Pour Tarek, je suis télégraphique et je m'excuse pour ça. I just wondering if, in your opinion, so when you are mentioning this very relevant issue of the legacy of the history, I mean the elements that, in a structural way, they contributing to shape the present relation between the, let me say, North African state and European state in the frame of the migration. Just I want to know if we can, in your opinion, put among these elements also the historical fact of the trans-Saharan trade and the distant commerce that was put in contact the North African polities and the African polities. So, in other words, if we can think about that the legacy of the afterlife of the trans-Saharan trade is still shaping in some way the attitude towards the migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
As we had the presentation, so maybe Giuseppe will start, then we'll have Tarek, and then...
Okay.
Also, because the first question was directed.
Thanks, Chiara. I don't know, maybe I answer in English, it's a little bit useful, no? So first of all, the first question, I have never chosen the scientific sources according to the skin of the authors. So I don't know what are you talking about. I can tell you that George Boreas come from Cuba. For what concern the other question, and I can also stress that the record number of black male that voted Trump are not white. For what concern the idea of Khalil, your question. Yes, the tax. So first of all, thank you for the question. Of course, it's an idea, and I think it's important to debate to change paradigm. So it's an idea. I think it's not an Italian solution because we need a global solution. Because so it's an idea to tax the winner of the globalization and of the immigration to help the loser, and to avoid that the loser can support the populism. So this is my thing. Then we can find also other solutions. This is so we can. I hope we can also continue to debate. So I think it's a global. And then I think also that we are too focused on Europe, but I think migration is a global phenomenon. So I had the pleasure, thanks to the Professor Morone, Professor Savino, to do something like that in Morocco. I have spoken also through the email with my colleague from Morocco, and they are starting to having our same problem as Europe. They are starting to ask for foreigner labor force. They are starting to have labor force from sub-Saharan Africa, and they are having problem in the management of this because they are again the winner and the loser of this situation. So my idea is let's think out of the box. I don't have the solution. I started to study this since the first book I told you on Marine Le Pen, because I also interview her on this issue, but of course I am not the supporter. I was finding a solution to avoid that what we are unfortunately seeing in this period. And I think, yes, you asked me about the change of paradigm, if there are other possible. I think we should open a dialogue that we had in the past. I thought about the L'Union du Maghreb Arab. No, we need to find this kind of multilateral solution, but we need to be also faster, because in this moment the legal organizations are faster than us. Just an example, and I conclude. If today a owner of a restaurant in Italy, and of course I am talking again today only about economic migration, not about refugee. That's another. If an owner of a restaurant in Rome, in Milan, needs a labor force for this weekend, do we really think that he will wait that Miss Meloni will plan how many migrants can entry in our country? No, he will find the best way, that is to ask to another migrants that work for him to call to Egypt, please let them know that there is place for them, and they will arrive regularly, because it's easier, not because they are the criminal. It's the only and the best way in this moment. So let's think how to change the paradigm, because if we say that there are no problem and the migration is wonderful, it's wonderful maybe for a part, but not for all. So
policy of trying to extract as many advantages from the European Union as she can, but at the same time she's also managing Italian national interests facing other interests. And clearly the old, I did not have time to go there, the old geopolitical conflict between Italy and France in Tunisia, it's as old as the occupation of Tunisia. I mean, it goes back there, and it went beyond the occupation of Tunisia, with the French always pointing to the Italians as being a threat, the Italian community in Tunisia as being a threat. And somehow, I don't remember, however, any time in our history where it was this conflict between Italy and France was used by a Tunisian president or ruler as a leverage, as is Qais Said doing now. And if there is something that I would give credit for, again, for Qais Said, is that he's clearly using the conflict, and he's Sadiq Bey. No, I'm talking about the modern times. Yes, Sadiq Bey. Sadiq Bey. But I don't think that Sadiq Bey had a major contract with the Italians as Qais Said is doing now with El Med, because one of the things I missed here, Nafti, when he talked about the memorandum, he mentioned that nothing is happening except for immigration. That's actually absolutely wrong. I mean, the Italian El Med project with Tunisia is a big component of what's going on. It's not so, and it's huge. I mean, what's happening with the El Med project is really huge, and it shows you that it's not simply about political discourses, and both of them are somehow racist and populist, and so there are deep down interests that are actually being established. Of course, the Tunisian perspective towards renewable energy, as it's embraced by Qais Said, is at the opposite of his discourse, because you know what's really interesting, maybe our Italian friends don't know that, but the Secretary of State of Renewable Energy in Tunisia is basically, his career, his CV is basically working for European renewable energy companies. So his basic plan is to have major partnerships with European. But he's following a balanced view, by the way, the Secretary of State of Renewable Energy in Tunisia, because some of the contracts are for French companies, including Total and some other, and with the United Arab Emirates, by the way. The United Arab Emirates is a major player now in renewable energy in Tunisia. Saudi Arabia is maybe coming in also on this field, but also the ILMED project is a big component on the other side. So it's not only about feelings or discourses. There is a lot of interest going on here, and certainly the Italians, as they are playing the renewable energy card with Tunisia, I mean, given the closeness, and for a submarine cable, when you have this basically small, short distance, it's in your interest to do it. It's maybe in our interest to do it. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have anything to do with... yeah, basically, and this takes me to Antonio's questions. Sorry. I thought Chiara said Antonio. Okay, Antonio. I'm getting mixed up. But I'm not. I know the difference between Antonio and Mario, certainly. And this is not Chinese names, so they are close to our cultural background. Let me start with Mario's questions. With regards to what are the prospects of Tunisia, which aligns, and I think the objective geopolitical hard concrete realities put us in, I would say, in a medium term, long duration term, regardless of who's gonna rule. I mean, Qais Said or whoever. If we have someone who's really in charge of power, in a democracy or not, because what we had in the last 10 years, we had a democratic transition, but basically no one wanted to be, I have to be precise here, wanted to be in charge. Every political player wanted to be having a little distance and not being responsible of the outcome of the next elections. But in a democracy, you should have someone in charge, clearly in charge. Qais Said now is in charge. Whoever is going to be in charge in the future, he or she are going to have to deal with the hard, concrete geopolitics. And the first one of them is that we're by default under a potential dominance of Algeria. As long as we're not going to develop a clear infrastructure of renewable energy that's going to allow us to take some distance from Algeria, and even with that, we're going to be more or less dependent to Algerian energy, Algerian gas and Algerian even oil at some point. And Algerian financial support, budgetary support, is essential each year for the Tunisian government as we're facing a deficit in our budget. But at the same time, that does not mean that is in contradiction with a close relationship with the Italian government. Again, whoever is going to be in power. Because what's happening here is because there is another major element that we're not taking into account, which is not a Maghribi issue, which is a MENA region issue, which is the relationship of the Maghreb to the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is not something minor. This is something really essential. When Morocco opted for normalization in exchange for recognition by the US of the Western Sahara, it was a strategic choice. It's not something that is just doing it on the side. It's part of a larger alliance that would include the UAE, that would include some basic strategic support by the US. And the French is also part of that. We know the French close relationship with the UAE as well, with the Emiratis as well. So there is some kind of crystallization of an alliance that is part of a larger alliance that goes beyond the Maghreb. The issue of normalization is not something that is, one of the main issues on the agenda of the U.S. administration. And by the way, any U.S. administration, not a Republican, not a Democrat necessarily, is that Arab countries have to normalize relationships with the Israeli occupying state, because that's what it is. And we're not seeing any, and this is only on the side, by the way, we just have a book in Arabic from Sisma about about what's happening in Gaza. This is essential. This is an essential element of the fight. And as I said, we were not seeing any prospects of a two-state solution with Trump coming back to power, with the rightist, and even, I mean, when you hear the Israeli Labor Party talking about what's their solutions of the conflict, you don't even hear with them a two-state solution. So we're not seeing any prospect of an actual viable solution in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that means that this is going to have a sustainable impact on the Maghreb. And the Maghreb, like what many people would think, is very close emotionally to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's very deep. It's very, very much part of the DNA. If there is there are few major top 5 ranking elements of the DNA of the Maghreb, I would say one of them is the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's there. It's essential. It's highly influential. So with that, I'm not saying that Italy is a pro-two-state solution, is anti-normalization. Of course it is for normalization. But I think the Algerians, as they are leading an alliance that is anti-Moroccan for local Maghrebi interests, but also for larger strategic alliances, it's going to try to build on its strategy on a conflict between Italy and the French, the Italians and the French. And because of that, Italy might be a potential close friend for this tripartite alliance. That is, it might work, it might not work in the coming months. The last point, which is, I don't know if that's basically, I'm not reading in the future. No one can read in the future, but just looking at these geopolitical hard, sustainable, long durée elements, I think an increasing divide is going to happen in the Maghreb between Algeria leading a side, Morocco leading another side, and the Algerians are going to use the intra-European basically competition, and they're going to push for this alliance to get closer to the Italians, whoever is in power in Italy. The other thing, which is the structural, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in that, even though it's very important. You know, one of the things I worked on is Jerba. And Jerba, which is an Ibadi island, one of its main elements, geopolitical elements, I would say, of Jerba, is that one of the reasons why Jerba resisted the interference of the centralized state in Tunisia throughout history, it was this networking with a trans-Saharan trade commerce, long durée one. The Ibadis were an essential component of that, certainly. From Tahart to Jerba to Jbal Nfusa, all of that, basically, all of these Ibadi merchants who were working through trans-Saharan Africa were an essential part of this. But at the same time, it brought with it a long durée kind of racist préjugé. I mean, it's difficult to deny that in Tunisia, deep down in our society, as is the case with other society, there is a cultural position that says, basically, that believes that a Tunisian has to be an Arab, a Sunni Maliki. For Tunisians, it's very difficult to accept that you can be Tunisian and not Arab, including not Amazighi, because Bourguiba's policy after 1956 was just to erase any Amazighi presence, and at the same time Sunni Maliki. And that is, by the way, one of the reasons why Tunisian foreign fighters were very enthusiastic in Iraq in leading in the civil sectarian war attacks against the Shia. You know, the most famous attack against Shia in Iraq in 2004 or 5 in Samarra was made by Tunisians. So it's they can't. Being black and Tunisian is not something that is. So that's why the way Tunisians describe black is something that is problematic. Tunisians call whoever is black as Usif, which is basically something almost like another term for slave. So there is that with the trans-Saharan trade. A lot of slaves were black slaves were coming to the Tunisian markets, and there was a long history of anti-black culture that is still there, especially in the south, but beyond the south as well.
It was there, and it had a role in distinguishing, basically, put it very simply, Ukrainians are welcome, Syrians not. and put it very simply. And I can just mention one example. There has been litigation before the Court of Justice of the EU about a relocation of asylum seekers among the member states of the EU. The EU, Brussels, in 2015 adopted a decision with which all the member states of the EU had to take a certain quota of asylum seekers. There was a support solidarity measure to help Italy and Greece, the main entrance doors geographically. So all the other member states had to take a certain quota of asylum seekers. Poland, Hungary, they refused to accept and relocate asylum seekers in their territory. So they ended up before the Court of Justice of the EU because they were violating EU law. It was a binding decision of Brussels. And in this case, before the Court of Justice, actually Poland, one of the legal argumentations used by Poland was exactly, we are not willing to take these asylum seekers because this would impair the ethnic and religious homogeneity of our country. So that's one of the reasons why we are not applying EU law and respecting EU law. That was actually used before the Court of Justice of the EU as one of the argumentations. So surely it was there, and it had its role in the so-called European crisis back in 2015. And then the other questions quickly about I will link try to link the two questions about this migration diplomacy and this trend of striking these informal deals with countries outside Europe. That's exactly EU, I think, is knowingly pursuing this strategy to try to avoid, circumvent legal accountability, legal responsibility, and indeed Tunisia is just one of the countries on the list of countries with which the EU is signing agreements. Next is Egypt. Already a deal has been closed with Egypt as well. In the past, Turkey, Libya, Morocco. I mean, if you look at the map, it's basically building a security perimeter around Schengen. It's an area of pre-security, of pre-control, so to say, in order to at least slow down arrivals before Schengen. It's a very clear strategy. And so what kind of EU law solutions might be used? I'm not sure, because this is not EU law. These kind of deals, agreements with Tunisia and with other countries are not legally binding agreements. It's migration diplomacy. It's not properly EU law. EU law, it's very technical law. It's very precise, very procedural. It's very technical. And these kind of deals, they escape this model. Again, memorandum, plan of action, strategic roadmap, all this kind of terminology that Brussels uses, which highlights the idea that something is being done. You know, it's strategic action, plan of action, roadmap, strategic whatever. All these adjectives suggesting that something is being done. It's not law from a point of view of international law and EU law. So it's complicated to control and to monitor these kind of agreements. I would say that there should be a need of control both before and after. So before signing these kind of deals and agreements, impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, for example, done in a credible way with the independent international observers, debates in the parliaments on both sides, both counterparts, involvement of NGOs, international there are authoritative international observers. So preventive control and impact assessment of this kind of deals. And then also after, control, monitoring after, of course, the closure of these deals. Judicial and extrajudicial control. So judicial control, courts and judges, but here again, there are issues because, for example, in EU law, it's hard for the court to judge these kind of deals. They escape, they are not EU law. So in terms of justiciability of these agreements, it's hard to feed the court with cases, with litigation. The court will say, I can't decide, I cannot judge this. And so, also in parallel, extrajudicial control also, and extrajudicial monitoring, parliaments, debates with NGOs, international observers, and keep an eye on these kind of agreements, because they are in the spotlight in the media when they are concluded. A lot of attention, leaders appearing before a camera, shaking hands, smiling, and all this strategic new agenda and roadmap, and then they kind of fall into obscurity, and then they fall. And it's important to keep an eye and keep monitoring them, I would say, but it's complicated.